The global arms industry. Yep, today we're going to talk about the nations and companies that produce big boats, big guns, fighter jets, and everything in between. You see, with nearly $2 trillion being spent on militaries around the world in 2019, it's important to remember that all those sophisticated systems and weaponry used in the hundreds of military bases around the world cost the taxpayer big bucks. But who are the big players in this often controversial global industry, and just how influential is it? Well, in order to really get a better understanding of what we're dealing with when we talk about the global arms industry, we've got to start with some context. Welcome to the global arms industry. So let's start off by defining what we mean by the global arms industry. The global arms industry is the industry in which manufacturers sell weapons and military technology across national borders. Pretty simple, right? Well, what's to be noted is that an arms industry is usually part of a national or sometimes international military-industrial complex, and this is when things get interesting. You see, a military-industrial complex is the relationship between a nation's military and its defense industry, which often receives public contracts to produce the fancy boom boom machines that only see the light of day for fancy parades or military exercises. By far the most well-known military-industrial complex out there is that of the United States. In fact, in the case of the US, it is sometimes referred to as the military-industrial congressional complex, acknowledging the US Congress as a third pillar that sustains its multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, these military-industrial complexes are important to be aware of when looking at the global arms industry, because these complexes have slowly been becoming more international in their presence. Meaning any foreign entity could yield more power today over a nation's policymakers, given the lobbying power and general entanglement between a nation's policymakers and its military-industrial complex. And with military technology and weaponry being significantly more complex today than they were 150 years ago, many smaller nations have had to turn to a relatively small group of countries and companies in order to get their dose of cybersecurity technology and big nuclear-powered ships that might as well be considered as their own micronations when out at sea. So, with the role of the military-industrial complex being outlined, let's now dive into what the global arms industry looks like today. Just how large is it? And is business booming? $1.917 trillion. This is how much money is spent globally on militaries. It's larger than the GDP of Russia, and it's truly an extremely high figure. In fact, this number represents a 3.6% increase on the previous year and equates to 2.2% of global GDP. However, although this is the figure often thrown around when comparing one nation's military to another, a nation's military expenditure does not necessarily point to a nation's arms industry being amongst the most innovative and impressive in the world. Just remember that Saudi Arabia has outspent the UK for multiple years, but you'll have a hard time looking for a Saudi arms company that competes with the British-based systems. So, in terms of measuring a nation's arms industry, one's military expenditure is not a great set of data to use. But recognizing that global military expenditure has nearly doubled since the late 1990s, it's fair to say that much of this additional spending will have been translated into more arms sales. This increase in the last 25 years has been down to a load of geopolitical factors, such as the fact that spending in the late 1990s was relatively low to begin with, given that the Cold War had recently finished and the Soviet Union was no more. Also, the US's war on terror got going in the 2000s, and of course the rise of China's economy, which enabled the Chinese military budget to balloon. Of course, there are a lot of other additional reasons, and if geopolitics is your thing, then you should totally be watching Caspian Report. Anyway, the figure of more importance to us is that of global arms sales, and from this graph we can see that global arms sales have been steadily rising over the last 15 years. And data for 2019 show that the 25 largest arms companies have seen an 8.5% increase in sales on 2018 data, indicating that the industry at a global level is currently experiencing healthy growth. But I'm sure you're wondering now, who are the big players in this global industry? Which countries are selling and which companies are behind these arms and technology sales? So here's a little guessing game. Which 3 countries do you think are the largest exporters of arms globally between the years 2015 and 2019? You can pause the video if you want to write down your guess. Okay, I'm sure most of you thought that the USA would be in the top 3, and you'd be right. The USA is by far the world's largest exporter of arms, responsible for 36% of global sales. Perhaps some of you would have said that China would be after the US, and this time you'd be wrong. The Chinese don't actually make the top 3. Instead, they rank 5th, representing 5.5% of global sales. In fact, here's a look at the top 15 countries by arms exports. As you can see, most exports originate from Europe and the USA, which isn't a huge surprise, but you probably didn't expect almost 85% of exports to come from these 2 regions. And to better understand the direction of certain nations on this list, here's the percentage change in sales on the previous 5-year period. As you can see, some nations like France, Israel and South Korea have seen pretty large increases, whereas Ukraine, Sweden and to a lesser extent Russia and the UK have reduced their arms exports. Now, some of you may be wondering why this data includes a period of 5 years as opposed to just a single year. And the answer to that question is pretty simple. You see, when it comes to the global arms industry, purchases between countries can fluctuate significantly from year to year. A country may purchase 10 fighter jets in 1 year, only then not to make another large purchase for another 4 years. So, in order to reduce how skewed this data can be, the norm is to group the data into sets of 5 years. But having said that, it still results in data like this from Portugal, whose exports increased 1,239% on the previous 5-year period, with 95% of those exports going to Romania. So it shouldn't take a genius to figure out what happened there. But moving on, let's now have a look at which companies are responsible for the production of these arms. Taking a look at the top 15 list, we can see that the arms industry is dominated by US manufacturers, with Lockheed Martin, the company responsible for the F-35 fighter jet, this bad boy right here, being the most active manufacturer in the industry, with half of the company's annual sales going to the US Department of Defense. Noticeable European manufacturers are BAE Systems, Leonardo, and Airbus, whose sales combined don't match that of Lockheed Martin's. Another major player present among the top 15 are these 3 Chinese firms, which may seem a little surprising to see on the list, given that we saw that China exports fewer in arms sales than France and Germany. But when we consider that the weaponry and technology aren't necessarily exported overseas, it makes much more sense. Perhaps there are 2 companies among this top 15 that don't strike you initially as arms manufacturers. Airbus and Boeing are the 2 largest players in the aviation industry, and all their innovation and research flying large tubes of metal above the ground comes in handy for defense ministries across the world. In fact, of Boeing's total revenue in 2019, 44% was classed as revenue that derived from its defense operations, a significantly larger share than in Europe's Airbus. But okay, we can see that Europe and the US dominate the production of military-grade weapons and technology, with China also joining the party. But where are all those weapons that aren't kept within a nation's borders ending up? Which nations are driving up demand for international arms transfers? So let's have another guessing game. Which nations do you think are the largest importers in the global arms industry? Pause the video to write down your top 3. Okay, the top 3 are Saudi Arabia, India, and Egypt. These 3 nations are responsible for over a quarter of global arms imports in the 2015-2019 period. If we extend the list a bit further, we'll find Australia, China, Algeria, and South Korea. These nations are a complete mix from an economic standpoint. We have highly developed economies, resource-rich economies, and relatively weak economies. However, importing arms is a geopolitical dance. Nations are willing to spend extra on their militaries, purchasing products from certain countries if it means that they have preferential treatment in other aspects of geopolitical life. For example, Saudi Arabia, the largest spender, is supplied mainly by the United States of America, and has ramped up its arms imports by an impressive 130% on the previous 5-year period. Or take South Korea, who have a vast industrial capacity at home, but share a strategically important alliance with the USA, and had 55% of their imports come from Uncle Sam. The decision to purchase military technology from a certain country can be a matter that has as much to do with the defense ministry's needs as it does with an economic or political favor for an ally. One nation that has really put its foot on the gas pedal is Qatar, who has seen a 631% increase in its arms exports, meaning the small nation of 3 million people purchased more than the 110 times more populous United States of America. An interesting fact to take from this set of data is that among the 40 largest importers of arms, the USA is the top supplier for 23 of them. And in the cases of Japan, Taiwan, and Morocco, the USA provides north of 90% of their arms imports, a very dominant share, which only reinforces the claim that the global arms industry is a US-dominated industry. So there you go. The USA takes the crown as the nation most responsible for the production and sales of weaponry across the globe. Whether that's to be celebrated or not is a whole other thing, but what it definitely does mean though is that much of the most sophisticated military technology remains within the hands of the US arms manufacturers. But despite all these figures and facts regarding the production of weaponry across the globe, there's one last fact that I'll leave you with that will help you understand just how large the global arms industry really is. And that is, even if you combine the world's top 15 largest arms producing companies, their total defense sales would still be lower than that of Toyota or Volkswagen, and marginally higher than Apple's. Which reminds us that the world's real manufacturing titans are those that solve problems like getting humans from point A to point B, and bringing people together through telecommunications rather than creating human-killing machines. Hi everyone, hit that like and subscribe button for the algorithm if you haven't done so already. Let me know your opinion about the global arms industry in the comments section below. Is too much money being spent on weaponry? And how controversial is the sale or purchase of arms in your country? Also, much of the data used in this video came from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and after the recording of this script, they released a new report on global military expenditure for 2020. They do some great work, and I'll leave a link to their latest publication in the description below for anyone who wants to check it out. I hope you enjoyed this video as always, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye.